Okay, it is new. Hi, everyone. This is Artie from Human Chapters. And I'll tell you a little bit about Human Chapters before we go on to our guest. So, with Human Chapters, humans are living narratives with a past, present, and future. These narratives constitute of a number of chapters across a lifespan. The aim of these conversations is to highlight a chapter of the narrative and unpack its connections to other chapters. I don't care whether people are natural storytellers, but I truly do believe each one of us has a worthy story to tell. An acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land which now comprises Greater Shepparton. We pay respect to their tribal elders, past and present and emerging. We celebrate their continuing culture and we acknowledge the memory of their ancestors. Today, our guest is Lachlan, and his chapter is My Personal Political Life. So, thank you so much, Lockie, for taking the time to have this conversation, and I'll pass on the floor to you. Feel free to introduce yourself.
No problem. Thank you, Artie. My name's Lachlan Slade. My pronouns are they, them, and he, him. Who am I? I'm a social worker. I'm a parent. I've grown up, I suppose. I was going to say I'll start at the start, but I suppose where is the start? When we look, and not to get too profound too early, when we look through our ancestry and through our lineage and all that. But I grew up here in Shepparton, or in Mooroopna, to be more specific. In a very working class sort of family. Struggled a little bit growing up financially, but always had set in my mind that university was where I was going to go, which was in some ways unusual in my family, but in other ways not. There was two other people in my family who'd gone to university. My uncle was a professor in dentistry. So not only did he go to uni, but he was teaching at uni. And my grandfather was studying a Bachelor of Arts in his much later age. But nobody else. So I don't think I realised how much I was breaking the mould back then to go to uni. Anyway, what I chose to study was social work. I found when I was in year 11, I was one of those rare people that knew exactly what they wanted to do in year 11, and I'm still doing it, which I didn't realise at that age that that's a strange thing. Very glad for it though. I originally thought I want to be a counsellor, so I thought I've got to be a psychologist. I went to an open day at La Trobe in Bendigo, and the psych representative wasn't there, but the social work representative was. And I got talking to the social work rep and I went, hey, that's everything that I want to be right there. So I chose social work from there on. And I know I'm jumping straight on in. I hope that's working. Cool. Yeah. I don't think I necessarily realised it at the time, but part of what I really liked about social work was that I could become a counsellor, a caseworker, a community development worker, a researcher, policy worker, activist, advocate, all from that very broad profession. And as the more and more I got into my social work journey, the more and more I developed I don't think developed's quite the right word, I uncovered within myself a political lens that I could see my life, the world through. And when I say political, I mean in every sense of the word. I mean looking at Canberra, looking at Spring Street in Melbourne. I mean the feminist sense of the word, that the personal is political, that every act, our very being in the world, is a political act and has political ramifications of how people treat us, how people are towards us. And we can try and ignore that. And many people do. And some days I do as well, because we need to sometimes. But I find that it's inescapable in so many ways. I think one of the ways where, for me, that was inescapable is, I suppose, in my gender identity, that I grew up in, around Shepparton, which is arguably, in many ways, a very conservative, very sports-focused community, which has many benefits for many people. And I, in case you can't tell from listening to me and looking at me, I do not fit the stereotype of male, of macho male. And I'm quite proud of that fact. And where that's taken me in my life, particularly in the early 2000s, growing up in Shepparton at Catholic school, I thought, okay, so I'm quite effeminate for a guy. So that must mean I must be gay, because that was the only point of reference at that time of my life. And I realised that, no, that's not it, because I don't find guys attractive. That's, kind of the vital element of being gay. And I later on, I suppose, particularly in the last few decades of my life, have started to go, okay, so gender is not necessarily something that is two very distinct, narrow categories of male and female, of pink and blue, of, playing footy versus cooking, or, whatever other horrible stereotype you want to put to it. I'm kind of something in the middle-ish, I suppose. And I often wonder that if masculinity were defined in a much more broad sense, that arguably femininity is classed in, that you can have and I use air quotes, feminine woman to a tomboy. If we had a very masculine man to a tom girl, maybe I'd be towards the tom girl. I'm still not convinced on what language to use for myself. And that's probably a work in progress. And I know that me showing up in the world in that way, in my gender, and dressing in colourful clothes and with, slightly dishevelled hair tonight, but, longer hair and earrings and a pink car and all the rest of it, I know that doesn't fit that narrative, and it means that it challenges people's view of what maleness or masculinity is. And it's something that I can't escape, and people that see me can't escape either. Yeah.
Okay. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions based on just some of the things you've mentioned? My first question is, you mentioned that it's you knew exactly what you wanted to do, and you were one of those rare ones. How did you know exactly what you wanted to do? And perhaps, sort of going to the roots in the past, take us through your journey of, what made you sort of go, this is exactly what I want to do and be in the world. Because that's, yeah, it is quite rare.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I didn't know it was rare at the time, because I think a lot of us are told that, in year 11, we've got to decide what we want to do for the rest of our lives. And that's a load of crap, frankly, because, it's careers these days, you can change. What told me that that's what I wanted to be? A lot of my friends at that time were coming to me to talk about the issues that they were going through.
Mhm.
Quite often, themes of sexual assault were coming up, which I think back at 16, 17-year-old me and go, wow, that's a lot to
Mm.
carry on your shoulders when you don't have a social work degree behind you to help you to process your place and role in helping people in that. And I've come full circle in that respect, that one of my roles now is counselling victims and survivors of sexual assault. And what I did know at that time was that I knew that just listening,
Mm.
that being someone that cared and showed empathy, which I felt kind of came naturally to me. I don't want to toot my own horn, but it was, something that I could, do fairly easily. And this is me looking back on that now, I saw that as a very radical act.
Mm.
And by that, I mean that there weren't enough people in that person's life doing that, just listening, just hearing. And I would say that the same could be said for a lot of people's lives right now, that I'm not going to pretend that just listening and understanding is a panacea for every mental health issue in the world right now, but it would help. I'm not sure by how much, but it would help by having friends and family that do a lot more shutting up and a lot more listening and a lot more believing and asking curious questions without judgment, without bias. And I know now as a parent that if one of my kids were to come to me and disclose something horrible and bad that's happened to them, it would be very difficult for me to be impartial and to not want to jump in there and sort it out in some way. But having that opportunity is, very important. And I thought, why not make a living out of it? So, yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That I can imagine being a young or a teenager then and having these interactions, the magnitude of it, perhaps when you were within that situation, not realizing the magnitude, but in hindsight, actually going how broad, how wide and deep it was for the other person, having that listening ear.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think so.
And my other question was in regards to your gender identity and being in a Catholic school. First one, what was that journey like when you first discovered that? What you said that you didn't fit in, but when you started to think about yourself and became more self-aware of your place in a sense in this world, take us through that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a funny one in a lot of ways. That I think it was year 10 or so. I came out, and it feels strange to say came out, because I promptly went back in because I'm like, no, this is not it. I only came out to a few select friends and the school that I was at. was, if I suppose, cliquey at worst and very, I suppose we all had our own little groups that were supportive of each other at best. And yeah, I was able to come out to a few friends and go, I think I might be gay. Look at me, I'm not the butchest guy around, so that must be it. It was interesting because I felt as though I certainly knew the church's view on that, and I'm not a Catholic myself. I was baptised Anglican, went to a Baptist youth group, went to a uniting youth group, and eventually came to a point, actually in year 11, I did a comparative religion subject and thought, hey, this Buddhism seems pretty cool, that I think I might go that. I think I've since moved from there, partly because of some of the Dalai Lama's very homophobic remarks, along with a few other things. But it was, I think, being a rebellious teen in a very non-rebellious way, as I was very much a rule follower, which is not the social work way. We're stereotypically the rule breakers for all the right reasons and in all the best ways. I didn't really care, frankly, about the church's view, and particularly given that it was a slightly more private thing at that time, and I was going, what is this about? From there, I continued on my merry way, I suppose, and I found myself getting, not long after graduating, into LGBTIQA plus settings within social work, of getting a lot out of working with my LGBTIQA plus clients, and eventually ended up working for an LGBTIQA plus suicide prevention program in the Macedon Ranges. And it was funny, one of the workers there said that I was the gayest straight man that they knew. And I'm like, yep, that's kind of sums it up. And yeah, in hindsight, I would have thought that being that into the LGBTIQA plus community, I would have, I suppose, been more aware of the gender binary and the fact that gender doesn't exist on a binary. But it took a little while for that light to click on personally. And it's probably been the last 5 years or so that I've been, probably a little bit more than that now, but that I've been more able to find something resembling a label for myself. I'm still not convinced of any particular label, but yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. And it's funny how the human mind works, like in terms of label but not label, and the label construct helps someone to fit in somewhere, but then without a label, what does that look like? It's an interesting topic of conversation.
Absolutely. And I think to most of the world, the label of non-binary is, or similar labels like pangender or genderqueer or something like that, is so incredibly new and not yet formed in a lot of people's minds of what that looks like and how that is. And I think I'm optimistic that the coming decades will see that come out a lot more, like we've seen just in the last year Sam Smith come out as non-binary, Demi Lovato come out as non-binary, and we're starting to see some role models for non-binary kids and adolescents in particular coming up through the world. And I think we're going to start, having better labels and better understandings of that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, Lucky, just to clarify, with a broad label, if that's the thing, for yourself, you consider yourself, is it non-binary or tell us to us a little bit about what the label might be if there isn't a concrete definition.
Absolutely. So I think non-binary kind of fits for me. Feminine man kind of fits for me as well. I think trying to describe it, particularly on an audio level, if you were to think of left and right, if left is masculine, right is feminine, centre is very non-binary, I find myself in the centre, slightly to the right, and a little more to the left, occupying that space, if that makes sense.
I'm actually drawing, sorry. So as I'm looking down, I've got my pen and I'm drawing or trying to draw what your analogy or description of it.
Yes. Yep. Excellent. And I wish I had have got one ready, but there's some excellent tools for exploring gender and sexuality. I was going to say with adolescents, but with anyone. One's called the Gender Unicorn, and it gives people the opportunity to place their gender on a spectrum of how much maleness, femaleness, otherness they feel. And particularly a lot of the trans and non-binary people that I've worked with, tools like that can be just so illuminating and so affirming as well.
Beautiful. And maybe if later you can send me a link to it, we can attach it to the introduction if anyone wants to look at it. Awesome.
Perfect.
So given that gender has been a huge part of your life, let's now delve into the political part of your life and that journey. Yes, take it away.
Absolutely. So I think one thing that I learned early on was that a social work career is a political career. And the reason for that is that when social work is done right, we not only counsel and provide that one-on-one support for our clients, but we challenge the status quo when the status quo doesn't work for people. And we do that in a number of ways. Sometimes it is working with the client that we've got to go to the police to report a crime or to help them to lobby their local MP to have a law changed. It could be that we work in social policy as a social worker, and part of that role is to change from a government and a policy level the structures that govern our country. And I know that a lot of people, when they come into social work, get turned off by that, which is fair enough. It's not for everybody. But it was something that I found myself more and more attracted to as I got into it. I think it was in my second year, I felt compelled, and I'm not sure why or how, that I needed to join a political party to make a difference. I think I was starting to form an idea that still sticks with me today, that to be the most effective in social work, I needed to work on the individual or the micro level, the community or the meso level, and the policy or macro level. And I thought joining a political party was the way to go. So I compared the political parties, and I found that the Greens Party was the most aligned to what I stood for in many, many, many ways. And I started to become more active in the local branch and get to know some people there, hand out the how to vote cards, be one of those annoying people. Interestingly enough, they find that is still one of the most effective ways of changing people's minds on how to vote and where to vote. So that's why they still do it. So I finished uni in 2009. In 2010, I made the outrageous decision to stand for state parliament for the state district of Shepparton. And I did so with the full knowledge that I stood a snowball's chance in hell of winning that seat, because the vote for the Greens was and still is around about that 3 to 5% mark. And we're in a very conservative area here. And while the Greens stand for what they stand for, they're not necessarily going to appeal to conservative voters. And I knew that going into it, and I had no delusions that I was going to be the one to turn it all around. But I saw it as an opportunity to challenge the conversation, challenge the way how that election campaign was going to be fought. That at that time it was a safe national seat, and in that year, the Country Alliance, which has since, I suppose, amalgamated in a way with the Shooters, Farmers and Fishers Party, they had a very large budget to spend in Shepparton, and a lot of their campaign was, we don't like the Greens, we are not the Greens. So it made for a slightly more antagonistic election campaign towards myself. However, on a hot day campaigning, the Country Alliance, one of the Country Alliance candidates gave me a bottle of water, and had a good old chat together about all sorts of things, which is one of the things I love about Australia's democracy, that it is so lighthearted in many ways. But yeah, what I could do in that election campaign was to campaign for marriage equality and campaign against family violence and campaign against poverty and campaign against climate change. And that was very satisfying because I could put out a press release, speak to the media, and quite often that story would get published. And that meant that if it was just Lachlan Slade, a social worker in Shepparton, that was less likely to get attention. But I could help to change the narrative. And that was also similar in 2013 when I moved over to Castlemaine in 2012. And I stood for the federal seat of Bendigo, a marginal seat. So that meant that there was more media attention and more likelihood of any of the candidates speaking up, particularly the Greens, where a lot of Greens voters would preference Labor. And that meant that if the Greens got a high vote, then Labor was likely to do well out of it. That if I spoke, then it had more of a chance of making a difference. What I loved about that campaign was there was a lot of opportunities. During Anti-Poverty Week, we held a $1 dinner for the community, and we used campaign funds to make that happen a little bit. And it meant that, at least for that night, some people that couldn't have been able to afford much could eat. Made sure that it wasn't a huge political rally either. It wasn't a highly politicised sort of thing. There was another instance where one of the local city councillors made some horrible remarks, and she had form for making many horrible remarks about people, about a woman with Down syndrome dancing in Hargraves Mall to a band that was playing. She told this woman to stop dancing because she was embarrassing herself, and did this in public. Justifiably, there was an outrage in Bendigo about that. And yeah, and I managed to work with some local disability organisations to organise a dance against discrimination on the front steps of the city council buildings. And again, that was something that gained a lot of attention, and as the NDIS was a big part of that election, and some of the more activism and the human rights elements of disability wasn't as factored into the discussion around the NDIS at that point. It meant that there was a bit of cut through and a bit of conversation started around that, and kept that story going in a much more positive direction as well. Yeah. So it's, I'm trying to think back to your question, but it's
about your journey, Lachlan. And I just wanted to ask, so for someone who might be listening in on this conversation that doesn't live in Australia, what is the Greens Party?
Yes, good question. The Greens Party is a left-wing party, progressive party. There's many Greens parties around the world, and they're more or less similar in their values, that they stand for the environment and for social justice, among many other things, and democracy. And particularly in Australia, in fact, from what I understand, Australia is where the Greens political movement began. Bob Brown was the first leader of the parliamentary Greens, and is still an absolute legend in Australian politics, full stop. Stands for climate action and for LGBTIQA plus rights, and a whole other swathe of social justice issues as well.
Sure. And you mentioned that with the Greens Party, you knew that you weren't going to be elected, or however you used campaigning as an opportunity to change the narrative. Sort of now looking back in hindsight, and you've given a few examples, but how did the narrative change within, like for you personally, but also within those collective interactions?
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
So with the narrative, so you wanted to have your story and talk about different things, bring things to attention. Looking back in hindsight, how do you think that changed with your involvement in it?
Yeah. Look, I think there was a certain amount of naivety going into it, that at the end of the day, my actions by no means changed fundamental parts of the NDIS or changed the debate around marriage equality or anything like that. But I certainly hope that it gave some people in the country Victorian communities that I campaigned in, hopefully a sense of hope, hopefully a sense of them being listened to, and that issues that mattered to them were finally being discussed. And I did deliberately go after some issues that I knew a lot of people faced, but were so underrepresented and not talked about in politics in general. Some of those issues were issues that were being talked about, but I felt weren't going in the right direction as well, like justice for refugees, and still a horrible, horrible blight on Australia's social and international policy that we illegally detain refugees offshore as a country. To highlight those issues when to essentially be a mosquito in the face of the major parties, that I'm loud and I'm little and I'm annoying. I might bite you a little bit, but I might annoy you for a little bit right now. And I'm not going to go away until the election's over, at least. Yeah.
And so sort of fast forward to 2021, what do you like? Have you witnessed changes? Of course, there are the obvious ones, but what has that been like in terms of growth, in terms of progress, or lack of? Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, it's wow. There's so much that. Yes, there's many issues where there's been big progress. We finally have marriage equality. And I know that that came at a hugely significant price. That I know that I was still living in Castlemaine at the time and working as an LGBTIQ specialist counsellor. In Bendigo at that time, there was a trans woman who was assaulted on a psych ward. And that was a hate crime directly linked to the marriage equality survey. That person made comments about, "You're one of the yes people, aren't you?" as part of that assault. And I know that that was tip of the iceberg sort of stuff, that the marriage equality survey came at a great, great cost to the LGBTIQ community. And a lot of our community is still getting over that and will never forgive Malcolm Turnbull, the government, the Liberal Party, for going through that unnecessary bullshit. I hope you don't mind me swearing.
It's all good.
Cool. And so, yeah, but we finally got it. And we've seen, I think, looking back at a lot of social movements in the past, the way that rights and the awareness of trans and non-binary people has been catapulted into the limelight is very heartening. The fact that we're suddenly talking about pronouns in 2021, even a few years ago, when, me in 2004, graduating from high school, did not know a thing about non-binary genders and transgender people. And that's very heartening, that people like myself, any other people that don't fit the narrow constructs of gender, are finally having something resembling themselves. We've still got a very long way to go with refugee issues, like I mentioned. We're going backwards and continuing to go backwards. And I optimistically think that the heat going off the issue, in terms of the media not reporting on it as much, might mean that the people in the community that are fervently against refugees have a chance to cool off, and for politics to recalibrate and to finally find some humanity in this area. I wish it didn't take this painful silence that we're currently in. I know it's not a complete silence, but in terms of mainstream media, it certainly seems that way. Yeah, we've got a long way to go there. We're finally talking about family violence in a big way and recognising that, and sexual assault. And we've still got an incredibly long way to go in that. And that is, of course, tied up in gender as well, that the more we recognise that men don't have to be macho men, and there's a huge can of worms there that I'm not going to go completely into, but that if we, recognise that control that is often expected of men doesn't have to be there, then that's part of the problem of family violence gone as well. There's a lot of hope and there's a lot of angst about many different issues with that, yeah.
Absolutely. And I sort of will backtrack a little bit and back to you mentioning Shepparton was or is quite a conservative place. Let's unpack that a little bit, because I think, it would just be interesting to see what that conservative nature is and a little bit of specificity to it, and then how it relates to today's conversations or today's openness, even if it's a little bit of openness.
Yes. It's fascinating because I feel for quite a while, I think because I've grown up in Shepparton, I didn't necessarily have the point of reference to recognise Shepparton's particular version of conservatism. And I realised that conservatism and progressiveness are another binary that is also not completely helpful, which is, I think, kind of where you're getting at. That I think, again, I think a label that comes closer to defining Shepparton is an agrarian socialism. That although most Sheppartonians would balk at the idea of being a socialist, and I think there is definitely a very strong sense of neighbourhood and community in Shepparton, even if that is sometimes very tribal and very, I suppose, tribal at best, cliquey at worst. And I think even though farming is, in terms of our economic mix, going further and further down the line of Shepparton's economy, it still defines Shepparton in a lot of ways. That a lot of Shepparton is defined by the footy clubs and the farms and these sorts of things. And that brings a lot of people a great sense of community. And that's certainly coming from my point of reference as a white Sheppartonian. And I'm not going to pretend to speak on the experience of the non-white community in Shepparton, that we have one of the largest Aboriginal populations, and of course we have a very diverse background of countries of origin and cultural and religious backgrounds in Shepparton that makes Shepparton so rich and diverse, and is often sometimes used as a scapegoat, I think, sometimes for a lot of social issues that go on in Shepparton, which I think much more fairly should be directed back at the fact that federally for a very long time, and in state politics until recently has been incredibly safe seats, and incredibly safe seats do not get government money. And when you don't get government money, you don't get the social services and the economic injections and so on and so forth. And not that that causes all social issues, and Shepparton has its fair share, but it's not necessarily worse than the next regional town. But it says a fair bit about where we're at. I kind of rambled a bit and went down a few rabbit holes, but I hope that answered it.
Yeah, no, that's that was really interesting to listen to, sort of coming from a non-political background, trying to go and sort of that bridge between the political world, but then the world we live in. And while a lot of us don't understand, and by a lot of us, I mean, I don't understand, I think it is important to understand some of these structures because they directly impact us and our quality of life, our contribution to society. And speaking, so sort of that's probably a good segue into, now that you're not within that political scene, but you've experienced it, what can we do to make our voices be heard, or even sort of play an important role in contributing to our voices being heard?
Absolutely. Awesome question. There's a lot that we can do, and I think probably the most important place to start, from my view, is what your strengths are as a person. And for me, for some reason, I did pretty well at speaking to media and writing up a press release and speaking to people on the street. And for me, being a candidate was a whole lot of fun, and I enjoyed the absolute hell out of it. In a very sadistic way, a lot of people would think, but I loved it. I think if you're a good writer, writing to your MP, and again, being that mosquito, that MP is probably going to, particularly if it's an MP that doesn't agree with what you're trying to say, is probably going to come back at you with platitudes and with political speak and with sweeping claims that, yes, we're doing this. You've got to come back at them, even if you're emailing them every day, or just once is enough as well. Speaking to your friends and family about picking one issue that really resonates for you, that you think needs changed in your community, in your world, in your country, and going for it. There you can work with your local sporting or community club or whatever it might be to, if it's, particularly today being Sorry Day, you might go, right, we need a reconciliation action plan. So we need to have a chat with some your elders and try and, work our way towards some reconciliation as an organisation. Whether it's in your workplace, getting some solar panels put on the roof, or, some actions that matter to you that are going to make even a little bit of change, because when we all make that little bit of change, it all adds up to a bigger change. And yeah, that's all we can do sometimes. And often once we get those little wins, we have a chance of being motivated and invigorated by those wins to go on and do it all again, or go bigger, or try something new, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Thank you for that. And I think it's important for everyone to know that while the political structures are on quite a hierarchy, we still have an important role to play in that. If an action or if something matters to us, then we can do something small about it. Doesn't have to be loud, doesn't have to be vocal, but just what we're comfortable with.
Yeah,
In yeah,
absolutely.
thank you. So now, before I sort of go on to the final questions, is there anything I haven't asked you? We've covered a lot of ground, but anything that you've wanted to say that I haven't even thought about?
Nothing that springs to mind, and I get the sense that I could talk forever. And you ask such wonderful questions that you could probably ask questions forever. Um, so, no, nothing in particular that springs to mind.
Sure. So I suppose one of the final or two parts to this question. One, what does a utopic world look like for you? And the second part is, what are the 3 to 5 key takeaways for our audience?
I should have given a bit more thought to the utopic one. I think there's an image in my mind that goes to sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows, and that'd be lovely. But a slightly more realistic utopia and less fantastical. I think a lot of it boils down to a lot more empathy and understanding of people, of people we've never met, of our neighbours, of our friends, our family, and listening to what people are needing, because people know what they need if only they were listened to. And it shouldn't take big political campaigns to make a big song and dance about that. That I would love to see a world where it was, a lot more empathy, a lot more understanding, and people going, oh, okay, I didn't realise that my actions had that impact on you. I can make some simple changes to make your life easier. And particularly when you've got the power of being a leader in the community, whether it be in politics or business or whatever, you have so much more responsibility and power to affect change. And you've damn well got to rise to that challenge because you've got the power and the privilege. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And the 3 to 5 key takeaways.
Yeah. I think to not see politics as a dirty word. We're often taught don't talk about sex, politics, or religion, and I think we've talked about all three today. So woohoo! I see that as a personal achievement. I think, and particularly, and I know in a lot of families, a lot of these conversations can get toxic really quickly. And I know through some of my own experiences that Facebook can be an absolute cesspool of hate and vitriol. And I think part of that is the fact that we can't see people's faces, that we're not talking face to face, but that, where am I going? That not shying away from politics and also holding it a little more lightly, that we can't necessarily expect to change people's thoughts and hearts when that's our aim. But when we speak from what we are passionate about and think is important, we might be able to affect change that way. And I suppose the other part of that is also to see yourself as a political being, that, like it or not, as you go through your life, the way you show up in your gender, your ethnicity, your religion, your whatever it might be, your age, that is a political statement in how and where you're showing up. And that's got to be, I suppose we've got to use that wisely and intelligently to be able to get the best for ourselves and for other people out of that, if that makes sense and isn't too ambiguous.
No.
I think, I'm trying to think if there's another takeaway. I think, yeah, the empathy and understanding, again, going back to that, is probably a big one. And also, I suppose on a more granular level, asking for people's pronouns and saying, what are your pronouns? How should I address you? And knowing that you're going to screw it up. That even within the trans non-binary community, people screw it up, and that's okay. And when you screw it up, it's not to be taken personally. It's not something that you have to overly apologise for. You go, oops, my bad. Sorry, they, not she, or whatever it might be. It can make the world of difference in someone's life, and it quite literally may save somebody's life, given what we know about mental health and suicide rates in LGBTIQ communities, and that the main reason for the mental health and suicide rates being transphobia, biphobia, homophobia, and communities that don't feel welcoming and inclusive. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lachlan, for taking the time out to have this important conversation about your chapter. It was really lovely, just to get your lens and get your personal perspective on your experience. So,
no problem. Thank you, Adi, for having these conversations. I've been loving listening to a lot of the other discussions that you've had, and it's always an amazing journey that I'm never necessarily sure where it's going to go. So thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. And I think something that I have personally learned through having all of these conversations is we as humans are quite similar in our need, our want, our desire, then sometimes is projected and sometimes is portrayed. So
yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I'll stop recording.